In 2008, 45-year-old Brian Sinclair entered a Winnipeg Community Health Center. He was in pain and needed assistance with his catheter bag. A doctor examined him and said that he was in the early stages of a bladder infection, and that the health center was not able to adequately treat his condition. The doctor gave him a note explaining his medical situation and sent him to the Health Sciences Emergency Department. 34 hours later, Sinclair would be found dead in his wheelchair, untreated. His bladder had burst. By the time Sinclair was discovered to be dead, rigor mortis had set in. Throughout his stay, other patients had asked staff and Sinclair how long he had sat there without being treated. Nurses shrugged off the complaints, saying that Sinclair was there to watch TV and that sicker patients were being seen first. Quote, in an inquest into his death, healthcare workers from the hospital said they'd assumed Sinclair was drunk and sleeping it off, had been discharged previously and had nowhere to go, or was homeless and had come to avoid the cold. End quote. Critics say that the inquest into Sinclair's preventable and tragic death did not look at racism as a contributing factor. However, quote, a group of doctors and academics from across Canada say an Indigenous man who died while waiting for care in a Winnipeg emergency room in 2008 was killed by racism, and say the subsequent inquest into his death didn't address the real problem. End quote. Joyce Eschquan lay dying in a Joliet, Quebec hospital bed. She turned on her phone and began recording and streaming live to Facebook, as the hospital staff told her that she was stupid as hell and that she'd made bad life choices, and asking her what her children would say if they saw her in this state. She could be heard begging for help. She died 2 days later, leaving behind a husband and 7 children. Her death has sparked outrage, but some officials continue to deny that there is a problem with systemic racism in Canada, particularly in the medical field. Quote, Eschquan's death comes only days before the anniversary of the Viens report, the result of a commission into the mistreatment of Indigenous people in the province. The report found it is impossible to deny Indigenous people in Quebec are victims of systemic discrimination in accessing public services, including healthcare services. End quote. Part of Canada's national image is one of diversity and kindness. Canadians take that image seriously. Sometimes we like to look down our noses at our neighbors to the south and pretend as if Canada doesn't also have a very serious history of racism, which runs through many of our institutions to this day. This topic is far too large to do justice in a single video, but we're going to take a serious look at some of the ways systemic racism thrives in Canada. It's not just America. It's time Canada also took a long look in the proverbial mirror. A few years ago, my uncle came to visit my mother. He's from Thunder Bay, Ontario. He's a high school teacher, and after dinner, talk turned to politics. He began talking about the Indigenous population in Thunder Bay. He claimed that they were always so drunk that they often just fell into the river and drowned. When I looked over at my fiancée, she had a horrified expression on her face that's honestly hard to read unless you know her well. I asked her if she wanted to go, and she just nodded her head. It wasn't until I was doing research for this video that I ran across the news stories that prompted my uncle to make those incorrect and racist statements at the supper table. In 2015, the police found Stacey DeBungy dead in the McIntyre River. Within a day, the police ruled that the death was non-criminal in nature, which was before they'd interviewed anyone who might have been in contact with Stacey the night before, and before they had received an official autopsy. Stacey's brother, Brad, said that one officer suggested that his brother, quote, may have passed out, rolled down the riverbank, and drowned, end quote. And Stacey wasn't the first or the last Indigenous person to go missing in the Thunder Bay area, with suspicious results from the police. In 2019, the Thunder Bay Chief of Police announced that they would be reinvestigating the deaths of at least 9 Indigenous people. Chief Sylvie House said at the time that, quote, 9 of the service's sudden death investigations are so problematic, I recommend these cases be reinvestigated, end quote. The Office of the Independent Police Review Director said in their report that, quote, racist attitudes had plagued and undermined the original probes, end quote. At first, the chief had resisted uttering the words systemic racism, but later relented on at least one occasion and admitted it might play a role in the shoddy police work, to say it politely. She also admitted that at least 4 other cases deserved another look. All of them students between the ages of 15 and 18 who had been found drowned in or near city rivers.
Realize enough The report hit a nerve in this community, years of frustration coming to the surface after the 206-page document from Ontario's police watchdog said what so many people in Thunder Bay already knew.
The fact remains that investigations were too often handled differently because the deceased was Indigenous.
McNeely's team looked at 37 police investigations involving sudden Indigenous deaths dating back to 2009. They found 1/4 of them were so fraught with problems, he's recommending they reopen the cases.
A number of investigators lack the expertise and the experience to conduct sudden death or homicide investigations.
Thunder Bay's police chief acknowledged there are, quote, systematic barriers in police and will continue to work towards bias-free policing.
Indigenous people make up approximately 5% of the population in Canada, yet are staggeringly overrepresented in Canadian prisons, making up over 30% of the prison population, meaning that they are 6 to 7 times more likely to be incarcerated than the national average. According to one report, quote, while accounting for 5% of the general Canadian population, the number of federally sentenced Indigenous people has been steadily increasing for decades. More recently, custody rates for Indigenous people have accelerated, despite an overall decline in the inmate population. In fact, since April 2010, the Indigenous inmate population has increased by 43.4%, whereas the non-Indigenous incarcerated population has declined over the same period by 13.7%. The rising numbers of Indigenous people behind bars offsets declines in other groups, giving the impression that the system is operating at a normal or steady state. As Dr. Gsz̳ɳa noted, nothing could be farther from the truth. End quote. This same report concluded that the indigenization of Canadian prisons was and is a persistent and pressing human rights issue, and a national travesty. One of the most enduring symbols of Canadian culture is the Mountie. Haven't you heard? They always get their man. But what a lot of Canadians don't know is that the RCMP has its roots in racism and colonialism. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police started out as the Northwest Mounted Police, and they were established to advance the government's agenda, which included taking land from the Indigenous population. I plan on making a more in-depth video on this subject in the future, but for our purposes in this video, I'd like to offer this. Quote, as authors Brown and Brown wrote in an unauthorized history of the RCMP, it was designed to keep order in the Northwest, to control the Aboriginal and Métis populations, and to facilitate the transfer of Indigenous territory to the federal government, with, in theory, minimal bloodshed. The NWMP and then the RCMP helped to force First Nations into reserves, tracts of land designated for them by the Canadian government, then made sure they didn't leave unless they got permission. The pass system, which ran from 1885 to the 1940s in Canada, gave power to an Indian agent to decide whether a First Nations person could leave the reserve. It was made into law by John A. Macdonald and enforced by police. The report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples cites reserves began to resemble prisons. End quote. As you can see, the racist roots run deep within both the Canadian government, who sanctioned the actions of law enforcement, and the deeply racist RCMP, who carried out those orders. The article I found the quote about why the RCMP was formed also included a testimonial by someone who had lived through the pass system. I'd like to share it with you because it illustrates a very small piece of what it meant to be an Indigenous person living under the pass system, and how brutal the RCMP actually were. Rand C. said, quote, I think about the early stories from that time when my gran said chiefs were dragged out of their homes and thrown on the ground and forced to shovel, like pig shit, stuff like that, and beat, and RCMPs just like standing around every day waiting for them to even just say one word in our language, so that they could beat them and throw them and haul them to jail or whatever. You know, never allowed to leave the reserve, never allowed to shop in the same stores, never allowed to do anything. And my gran said that was her reality of her whole life growing up. End quote. And the atrocities didn't stop in the 40s. Up until this very day, the RCMP is used to enforce the Indian Act. The RCMP took children from their parents and put them inside Canada's residential school system, which was an attempt at a cultural genocide of the Indigenous peoples. If you'd like more information on those schools than what I'm about to offer in this video, please check out my residential school video. The link can be found in the description box. In short, these church-run, government-funded schools operated until the mid-1990s, and were responsible for 150,000 children being separated from their families and denied their cultural heritage. Children were raped, beaten, and some lost their lives. Those schools leave behind a terrible legacy that continues on to the present day. And the RCMP, the shining example of Canadiana that is recognizable worldwide, was one of the main weapons the government wielded against the indigenous peoples. In America, many police forces were formed from slave patrols, people who were hired to catch slaves who had escaped. In Canada, ours were formed to abuse indigenous peoples, and today we ignore and make excuses for that racist history and how the consequences play out today. There are numerous examples of how systemic racism affects Canada's indigenous populations. For example, 47% of indigenous children in Canada live in poverty, which is more than 2.5 times the national rate. If you're looking just at children living on reserves, that number rises to 53%, which is 4 times that of white children. In 2011, almost one half, 48.4% of Aboriginal people aged 25 to 64 had a post-secondary qualification. In comparison, almost 2/3, 64.7% of the non-Aboriginal population aged 25 to 64 had a post-secondary qualification in 2011. I could go on and on with statistics illustrating my point. Canada has a long history of systemic racism, and while our leaders and our institutions don't want to admit there's a problem, once you start taking an honest look at the numbers and the heartbreaking stories that accompany those sterile numbers, you can tell it's a widespread problem. If you're Canadian and watching this video, I hope you'll think about the facts presented to you here and think twice about looking down your noses at our American neighbors. Yes, they definitely have their own problems with systemic racism, but never forget that we do too. If you found value here, please give this video a thumbs up. If you'd like to support my work financially, you can find a link to my Patreon in the description box below. This was a hard video to produce, and any help you can provide is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
You take me home, invite me in. The lights go down and we begin.